1931 was a landmark year for classic horror, seeing the birth of Frankenstein and Dracula for Universal, ushering in the modern classic horror era. But also released that year was an all-time classic from Paramount, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was first published by Treasure Island author Robert Louis Stevenson in 1886. According to popular legend, Stevenson burned his first draft of the book upon his wife's criticisms to the story. But the story's meditation on the dual nature of man would go on to become a classic, inspiring everyone from Stan Lee's Incredible Hulk to Jerry Lewis' The Nutty Professor. Hollywood's first attempt at the story way back in 1920 starred John Barrymore. The story was then attempted for the sound era with a bold film directed by Ruben Moliman, who was no stranger to making talkies of silent classics, as he would go on to remake Mark of Zorro starring Tyrone Power in 1940 and Blood and Sand in 1941. As the story goes, Dr. Henry Jekyll is an honorable and idealistic young scientist whose charity and compassion seems boundless, while at the same time maintaining a not too deeply buried dark side. We're introduced to him in the film from his point of view, stopping only briefly to see him in a mirror. This same concept was used in Jerry Lewis' The Nutty Professor with Buddy Love's introduction. Jekyll becomes the source of consternation to his scientific peers for his outlandish theory that he can separate the good and evil natures of man, allowing the good to flourish and eliminating evil. Even his good friend and colleague, Dr. Lanyon, played by Holmes Herbert, is skeptical. During his walk home from university one evening with Lanyon, Jekyll comes between an altercation between the beautiful dance hall girl Ivy Pearson, played by Miriam Hopkins, and her would-be suitor. Hopkins was a successful actress playing in several dramas of the day, being nominated once in her career for playing the title role in 1935's Becky Sharp. Henry returns Ivy to her apartment to examine her. He is a doctor, after all, and Ivy takes a shine to him, trying not so subtly to seduce him. Now, this film was made in the pre-Hays Code era, where films were not as strict as they would later become. It seems almost shocking that Hopkins was allowed to show as much skin and act so provocative in a film this old, giving the film a very unique quality. A few years later, with the Hays Code in full swing, the film's more steamy scenes were removed for re-release. Henry politely removes himself with Ivy's tempting plea, "Come back soon," fixed in his mind. Being madly in love with his somewhat bland but earnest fiancée Muriel, played by Rose Hobart, Henry comes against opposition from his future father-in-law, Brigadier General Sir Danvers Carew, played by Hallowell Hobbs, who insists on a lengthy engagement, taking Muriel away for a vacation. As the old saying goes about idle hands, Henry spends his time during her absence working on his formula. He decides to test it on himself, and thus Mr. Hyde is born. Interestingly, he's never referred to as Edward Hyde as the novel refers to him. Henry only seems to come up with the name Hyde when put on the spot by his butler. Mobodin makes some very stark choices here as a director, with many claustrophobic close-ups and not so subtle images, such as Henry looking at a skeleton when contemplating taking the formula for the first time, or a pot boiling over when he finally gives in to taking the formula a second time. The film also employs many innovative fades and wipes unique for its time. The transformation scene was revolutionary for special effects of the period. Instead of the standard time-lapse photography used in films like The Wolfman, although the scenes of Hyde reverting back to Jekyll were achieved that way, a new process was used by applying makeup on March that would only show up under a special light, thus allowing the camera to pick up the transformation in real time by gradually revealing the light, making his skin color appear to change. With Hyde's evil persona in full swing, he pays a call on Ivy as she's working as a singer in the dance hall. She's understandably repulsed by him at first, but eventually she becomes his prisoner in a lavishly furnished apartment. It's tragic seeing Ivy, who was a very brash and fearless character, become completely wrecked by Hyde in a matter of a few scenes. Again, it's pretty strong stuff, not typically associated with films of that era. Eventually, Muriel returns and Hyde decides to return to his persona of Jekyll, leaving Ivy alone. In his disgust over what he's done to her as Hyde, he sends Ivy £50. Ivy returns the money to him and begs for his help against Hyde's abuse, and once again tries to garner his affection. Unfortunately, Jekyll no longer has control of his transformations. He changes to Hyde again against his will and returns to kill Ivy. This was probably the one thing I didn't like about the movie, the fact that Ivy has to die. It seemed in rather poor taste to me that after all the suffering she had to endure, she isn't permitted to live through to the end, and Muriel does. It probably would have been more effective if Hyde had killed Muriel, Jekyll's true love. But perhaps because Ivy was portrayed as a woman with shady morals, it was decided to make her the sacrificial victim. In order to escape from the police, Hyde confides in Lanyon, who gives him the chemicals needed to transform back into Jekyll. Now, I've purposely held back from talking about Fredric March so far because he really deserves the focus of a complete segment. He won the Best Actor Oscar for his performance in this film as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, sharing it with Wallace Beery for The Champ, which I guess sharing an Oscar wasn't uncommon in those days. He'd been nominated before in 1930's The Royal Family of Broadway. He was also nominated for the 1937 version of A Star is Born, before winning a second Best Actor Oscar for 1946's The Best Years of Our Lives. March gives a haunting performance as both Jekyll and Hyde. They seem to be played by two completely different actors, his performance is so convincing. But it's in his role as Jekyll on which the film hinges. He's taken through wild idealistic optimism to utter abject despair by the end. He pleads to God for forgiveness and protection from what he's become, and heartbreakingly gives up his love for Muriel for her own safety. It's a powerful and moving performance worthy of the award. In the end, he unwillingly transforms to Hyde again and attacks Muriel. Her father comes to her aid and is killed by Hyde. Hyde retreats to his lab and becomes Jekyll to throw the police off. But Lanyon can no longer keep silent, identifying the killer's weapon as Jekyll's cane, identifying Jekyll as the killer. The transformations happen so rapidly at this point that Jekyll changes yet again. It's also amusing to note how much more progressively repulsive Hyde gets with every transformation, as if the continuous blackening of his soul is made manifest in his flesh. By this point he looks so ghastly one wonders how much farther from grace he can fall. Also, the more grotesque he becomes, the more animalistic his movements become, with him swinging almost ape-like through his surroundings. Eventually Hyde pulls a knife and is shot dead by the police. There, for the final time, he transforms back to Henry Jekyll. The true tragedy is that of all classic horror's mad scientists, Jekyll had the most noble beginnings. To ascend to the level of angels, only to find that by trespassing on God's domain, he'd been brought down beneath the level of men, to that of little more than an animal. Say it with me, everyone. He meddled in things mankind was meant to leave alone. The story of the good doctor and his not-so-good alter ego would be remade several times in the future, most notably in the bland 1941 version starring Spencer Tracy and Ingrid Bergman. Legendary horror icon Boris Karloff also played the role in the 1953 classic Abbott and Costello Meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There was also a musical version starring David Hasselhoff, which included the minor hit This Is the Moment. But nothing will ever compare to this version. It's a classic in every sense, with great casting, bold direction, and is the ultimate in suspense, horror, and drama, which should not be missed. I'm giving 1931's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde 5 stars out of 5. This is Johnnie Torch reminding you once again, keep the flame burning brightly, and I'll be with you again real soon.